Hi, my name is Keith Wayland from RPI Consultants.
And my name is Richard Leigh Stout.
And we're here today to present on best practices in ERP procurement that specializes in ERP implementations. And we've been doing this for over 20 years.
Over that time, we've responded to numerous RFPs. We've been involved in many system selection events. And we've been fortunate enough to have been selected and actually implemented the solution. And we're drawing on that experience today of all of our, we're drawing on that experience today of RFPs that we've seen, RFPs that we've responded to, and projects that we've launched based off of a procurement event. And we're gonna point out some of the things that impact the implementation and the end result of that software selection and implementation, and some of the things that you could do prior to a procurement event to set yourself off on the right foot.
Yeah, hopefully this perspective will be helpful to you in your future endeavors. So starting off, let's talk about some of the things that you can do before you commence that system selection.
Yeah, doing your homework is absolutely key here before drafting up an RFP and putting it out on the street. The very first thing that we recommend is engaging with industry experts. And by that, I mean unaffiliated industry entities, for example, GFOA for public city, county utilities, to identify some potential options for your demographic needs and size.
You could also talk to some of your peers, right? See what they're running today, what they recently implemented, how it's going. And I think it's really important too to take the opportunity to reach out to potential vendors that might be a fit, right? Mm-hmm. It's a very different process pre-procurement when you can have a dialogue, you can learn about them, you can have a smaller group that's involved in maybe getting little overviews or understanding strengths and weaknesses and understanding what their overall market and market strategy is. When you look at the procurement process, it can be very rigid, right? And it allows for a fair evaluation, but maybe not as much insight.
Yeah, use a more informal process, both to pre-qualify maybe the list of software vendors that kind of fit into what the scale is of the solution you're looking for, right? Like every organization that's shopping for an ERP is going to fall somewhere between the smallest size that vendor is going to serve and the largest size that vendor is going to serve. And you want to take a look at what packages are out there that are appropriate for you. You also want to use that as an opportunity to get some education, right? You know, having informal conversations with software vendors, we're going to get you a little bit more prepared about what you should be looking for and what are the different factors that differentiate the different solutions that are out there.
Not to mention narrow down the candidates, right? Yeah. Have a more efficient process by understanding who's really legitimate, viable option for you.
Exactly. And the next thing you might consider once you have a list of vendors that you're pretty interested in is taking a look at what documentation and information is available out there publicly. Try and do a Google search and see if there's application documentation out that's available. And if there is, take a look through and see how easy it is to understand and picture yourself using that application and following this reference information and see, is this something that my business teams would find easy to use? And if there's no documentation available on the internet, consider that a red flag, right? Why is there no documentation out there? Is it because the product's new? Is the documentation not created yet? Mm-hmm. Or is it just not shared? Is it just not to the level that the vendor feels it even can be public facing, something they kind of need to hide behind a support portal until they've already sold you the software?
Should also consider doing an RFI, right? So an RFI allows you to more open-endedly gather information, right? Sort of understand the vendors and where they're coming from before you try to line them up in a more structured method. And I'd say one of the big things we find is that it's good to get budget estimates from from vendors, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's system selection companies, they've done this for a long time, but it's different what we have today with SaaS multi-tenant versus the things in the past. Sometimes customers go in with budgets that aren't realistic and then are surprised at how much it's going to cost. So, at the very least with an RFI, you can get a true understanding of what this might look like.
Yeah.
All right. So moving on, let's talk a little bit about the impact of requirements, which is huge. My vision is system selector walks into a room, puts up a list of requirements, says, which ones do you want? And the audience responds, all of them, right? And in part we understand, right? This is an event that happens every 2 decades, right? You want to try to replace as much as you can. And there's this aspiration that the single platform is gonna be able to handle all your business needs and applications. The reality is that no ERP does everything, though.
Right. There are certain core functionalities that ERPs have been doing for a long time, and they're really good at. There are other, maybe edge use cases that perhaps the ERP extends functionality into, but maybe it isn't as well deployed or as well used among the customer base. Or perhaps that edge use case requires a third-party or best-of-breed application to be plugged in to meet that requirement.
So what happens then is the response is going to have additional solutions and the integrations, right? So this is going to add license costs, this is going to add services costs, and it's also going to add a complexity to your project, right? It's going to add risk to the overall implementation.
Yeah.
I would say that often when we look at requirements, 90% of the requirements are met by the core ERP, and that's about half the services costs, right? And those edge or best-of-breed products tend to be the ones that add a lot of layers of professional services and licensing. What should I expect when I look at what an ERP should do? What's core ERP functionality?
Yeah, core ERP functionality, of course, is financials. It's general ledger, it's payables, receivables, asset accounting, your banking, procurement processes. It should also include human resources, benefits administration, payroll. It should also include some talent management functionality, such as recruiting, performance management, and functionality like grants management.
Right, definitely this generation of ERPs should have that added functionality. What about from a technical perspective? What expectations should customers have?
Yeah, from a technical perspective, you're looking for a robust application that includes its own workflow engine or robotic process automation engine, so that way you can automate manual processes later on after you're live on the system. You also want to look for something that has open APIs that's easy to integrate with other applications, with other modern cloud-based applications. You want to look for a system that's going to make your data, expose your data and your processes to integrate with other systems or tools that you have to build upon core ERP functionality or functionality that's delivered from the software vendor. Obviously, you want a system that's going to support single sign-on with your directory architecture. Ideally, you've got a system that includes a configurable web portal, meaning a single entry point to your ERP system that you can bring in third-party systems or other applications under that same navigation framework. That makes it a lot easier for business users because they have just one place to go to access all of the applications that they're going to be using during the business day. And finally, from a technical perspective, don't underestimate how this application works on mobile devices, right? Historically, ERP applications have been built to be used on the desktop, but more and more it's becoming, the value of having access to those applications on the move or under different working conditions, right? Like taking a laptop and working from home that might have a smaller screen than the screen you use at work is becoming more and more important. So having an ERP system that will work on many different modes of access is certainly very valuable.
So these are all requirements that you should expect from your core ERP, both business application functionality and technical. What are ones where best of breed solutions get brought in that add to that overall complexity and cost?
Yeah, so there's a lot of industry specific solutions that often map to a best of breed application. One, for example, is budgeting, right? We often see there's a budgeting application that's very prevalent in a specific industry, such as municipal governments or such as healthcare, that is your
Catered.
is catered towards that industry, and you're best served going with that rather than a more generic functionality in your ERP.
We often also see this in the revenue side, whatever the customer vendor engagement is, billing, that tends to be industry specific as well.
100%. You know, ERPs are known as back office software. You often have a front office complementary system that needs to integrate with the ERP.
Absolutely. I would say another thing to watch out for in requirements is, I call them exception-based requirements. So this is an event that requires manual intervention that does not happen very often, and that the business seeks to automate, which makes sense, except the actual process of automation and maintaining that automation is going to cost you more than a manual event. One example that I have can relate to is sometimes you have a resource that leaves, like say on FMLA, and they have benefit copays that there's no longer a salary to offset. So you need a way to actually send them a bill, right, for the amount that they owe. And small organizations handle that manually. If you have 20, 30,000 employees, then maybe there's some opportunity to automate because there's enough volume. But for most of the small ones, it's just not worth it. And we tend to see a lot of these sort of use cases. They're just very rare, and the business wants them, but is it really worth it? It's going to add cost, and it's going to add long-term support too.
Yeah, oftentimes when you're working with your stakeholders, trying to gather what the requirements are, especially ones that might be unique to your business or that your current system doesn't meet, try and keep in mind what's a hard requirement versus what's maybe a nice to have.
Totally.
And if none of the ERP systems that are responding support that nice to have, I think that tells you it's probably more of a custom process rather than something you should expect to be out of the box.
I think that's one of the challenges for us is like we can make anything happen, right? But at what cost? The other thing that you got to look at is we often see we want to implement leading practices. We want advice on how to do this.
Yeah.
And sometimes when we go in, we get a little bit of a different challenge, right?
Right, 100%. Obviously, as system implementers, we like to see that a client is open to change, right? That a client says, we don't need to redevelop all of the business processes that we've had over the past 20 years that were probably in part driven by how our legacy system worked. Yeah. Right? But we want to adapt our business processes to the new system.
Which is great.
I think that all clients should have some level of adaptability or an interest in leading practice implementation. The challenge that we have is sometimes the consensus on that goal doesn't reach to all of the business users and application users that we're working with to design a system. And sometimes even that could come out in an RFP. Right. We see hints of that.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you have things that cannot change because they're regulatory requirements as well, right? So just understanding the difference between those.
Right. We understand that there are some requirements that you have that might be regulatory in nature or things that you absolutely must comply with. And it certainly makes our job easier if that's really clear in the RFP. If you can provide clarity around what are the requirements that you absolutely must meet versus what are the requirements that perhaps there might be some flexibility in terms of vendor recommendation. Should we meet this requirement the way that we do it today, or should we consider solving that requirement with a different process that maybe better aligns with the solution capability?
All right. So as you can see, requirements are of huge importance in terms of the responses you're going to get and the overall cost of those responses. Now, we get to the RFP itself, right? So usually the RFP, we look at it as sort of two parts, right? One is all the contracting, regulatory requirements that your particular business or industry or demographic has that you're going to have to comply with, right? And so that's just part of the process. The second is something that describes what the organization is attempting to achieve, right? The drivers, how it's looking to go about this, what the project will look like. And there are certain things that we look at, certain characteristics that will cause us behind the scenes to increase our estimated effort and therefore services costs.
That's right. And one is if the RFP is just a little bit too vague when it comes to requirements. I mean, one example is we see the vendor will develop all of the technical integrations that are needed. What integrations? All of them. Can we provide a list of what the current system has? I mean, do we have an understanding of what those integrations need to be? If we're asked to estimate the work effort to build out a lot of integrations, but we can't ascertain maybe what those might be from reading the RFP, that's going to cause us to estimate conservatively. It also tells us that maybe the client hasn't really done the homework to develop that technical inventory of what's in the system, and that's something that we're going to need to accomplish during the discovery phase.
Right, so that's going to extend the timeline, that's going to extend the services, and that's going to increase the cost. Well, that is sometimes the perspective of some of our customers is, well, shouldn't you know what integrations belong with ERP? And the answer is no. It is hugely varied within industries across customers, what systems they have and what systems they deploy integrations and how those integrations are. Yeah, there's some basic ones I'm going to tell you that you're going to need, right? You're going to need something that goes to the bank. You're going to need something that goes to your benefit providers. I can tell you those.
Exactly.
But
and
some people have...
We can often include those when we see they're missing.
But some people have key card integration and many other things, right?
Yeah.
So another thing that we look at is how much conflicting information is within the RFP. Is there a section of the RFP that says we're going to keep this system we have in place with its functionality, and then it shows up on the requirements, right? And this can vary in many ways. Just trying to give an example there, but in general, when we see conflicting information, what we see is a client that potentially hasn't reached consensus internally, right? So once again, we're going to have to hedge and say, well, we got to price it out as if they do want this functionality. And also we're going to have to add to the timeline because we probably have to help them figure that out internally, right, to make that decision.
Yes.
So we're going to increase our cost.
Another example of some red flags that we see in RFPs are when the response that we need to put together is just very onerous. And when I say onerous, I mean it's requesting that our response be written out in a very specific way that requires us to sort of map out our answers into maybe a terminology or a framework that we don't typically use. Let's talk about methodology, for example, right? ERP implementation methodology, it's really not that different from system to system or partner to partner, right? Everybody's using a waterfall methodology that starts with the planning phase, with discovery, requirements definition, moves on to design. You have a number of testing cycles as you iterate over that design. You prove out that all of the technical work is working, that all of the integrations work. You train up all the staff, prepare the organization to adopt the solution, and then you launch. Every ERP vendor and every implementation partner has put their own spin on that methodology. They perhaps use different phase names, or they perhaps have brought in some innovations or some enhancements to different parts of that methodology that set them apart. It's challenging for us when a specific methodology is prescribed in an RFP because we need to take our typical methodology that we've then adapted for this specific project or opportunity and then map it out to whatever terminology or phases that the RFP requires that we follow when answering.
And I would argue that it doesn't help with the evaluation because we know how we do it and we've done it many places, right? And that's going to be the most efficient. So having to retrofit everything to different terminology or moving it around doesn't actually help. And if what you're trying to do is make sure that you're comparing apples to apples, which I think is a driver, there are better ways to do that. Ask what's the level of training? What is the training plan? What is the level of change management? You can get to those things that you feel like people might be leaving out. How many testing cycles are there? Or you can read the vendor's methodology to see how clear is it. Do I understand it?
Yeah.
Who has specific questions about that? So I actually think you get a lot more value looking at what the vendor's approach is than dictating it. It can also happen with a prescribed timeline, for example, right? It's like, this is the timeline we're going to use. We're sitting back here going, that's too short, that's too long, that doesn't make sense, we're having to accommodate. I would definitely ask vendors. Maybe that's something you can get a little bit more insight in the RFI. And a new one that catches us off guard every once in a while.
Printed responses.
Printed responses. It still happens. And we're always a little bit shocked, so.
Yeah, this is obviously difficult for all of the respondents to meet those requirements. From our perspective, it seems kind of unnecessary.
Yeah, it seems pretty old school. All right, so moving on. Let's do the 411 on conversion. So we often see a long list of historical transactional requirements that can be very costly to put into a new system.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about that?
We understand that oftentimes it's the requirements that business users have access to go back and look up transactions or report out on transactions that happened maybe over the past 7 years or possibly even longer time horizons. This requirement often drives a conversion scope in an RFP that requests, we'd like to move all of our historical legacy transactional data from the old system into the new system, because business users don't want to have to juggle 2 different systems when going back to do inquiry. And oftentimes organizations are looking to shut down a legacy system so they know that data won't be accessible in its native application anymore. The challenge with that is converting data into a new system means transforming that data to meet the new system design, the new structural configuration of the application, and to align with business processes that might be changing as part of that implementation. And all that might yield converted data that no longer looks quite the same as it did when that transaction actually occurred under a different system, under different organizational structures, with a different set of master data in place.
Is there a better, much cheaper solution to address that need?
Absolutely. Our recommendation is to include a data archive strategy as part of your implementation. There are many different ways to hold legacy data in such a way that it is better representative of that transaction at the point that it occurred, rather than trying to map it and change it, right? And all of the ERP vendors provide some capability to hold archival data in its current state without transformation, so that way you don't have to go to a different system if that's not what you want to do. We'd like to see RFPs that include a reasonable transaction conversion scope and also make it clear that a certain amount of legacy data still needs to be moved into the new system, but can be moved into a more of an archival state.
So if most of the historical transactions are going to go into the archival state, what should you be converting into your brand new ERP?
Yeah, so first and foremost, you need to convert all of the master file records that are in your current system. When we talk about master file records, that's something like a chart of accounts, organizational structure, the employee master, vendor master, item master, customer master. We recommend moving all of the active records, and usually only the active records or records maybe that have been used in the past couple of years, so that way you can leave behind legacy master records that are no longer relevant. But in some cases, we actually do recommend bringing full files over.
Like the employee file.
Like the employee file, so that way you can identify any rehires.
What about subsystem transactions? Are there any there that we should be converting?
Yeah. Subsystem transactions is really where it gets tricky. And we look to minimize the overall amount of subsystem transactions that we're bringing in. That said, you do need to bring in the transactions that are required for business continuity on day one of using that new system. What I'm talking about there is a couple of years of GL transactional data, as well as GL summary balances, any open procurement, payable, or receivable transactions, for example, any open purchase orders that you're still receiving or invoicing against. And then in the HR area, obviously your current benefits, enrollment, and then payroll history, or basically any history that's YTD that you need to report out at the end of the year, an entire year's worth of data altogether.
And obviously any balances, inventory, accruals, and so forth, right?
Of course.
All right. Let's talk about the demo phase. So we have some recommendations from how you structure demos, right? So this is after your RFP, you've narrowed down some vendors, you're bringing a wide audience. One that we do see pretty commonly is to theme out each day, right? Have one day for finance, have one day for HR. There's going to be multiple components to each, but at least you let those target audiences have the specific time that they can dedicate to being there because you want their participation.
Organizations that have really gotten a lot out of the demo phase are organizations that focus their demo requests on capability or system nuances that are really important for their organization and are going to help differentiate the different software packages they're going to see, right? Every ERP system can process a journal entry and pay an invoice.
Trust us.
Trust us. Seeing how that works in a demo, sure, maybe that establishes the ease of use, some basics on navigation, but it's not going to prove that the system is doing something that you're going to be unsure of its capability. However, more complicated requirements that are maybe specific to your organization, specific to your industry, are important to see in a demo, such as handling fund accounting requirements or tracking labor distributions or grants reporting.
Right, or maybe you're tracking and capitalizing costs for a new building, right?
Yeah.
I would also keep in mind that you want to make sure you hit certain things. I mean, most of these demos many of them have scorecards, and often large audiences. But if you give the vendor the flexibility in terms of how they map that out, they can go to their natural demo state, and that matters. Why does that matter? Because it's going to have a better flow, right? One of the challenges I feel like that people underestimate in the RFP, in the demo selection, is your audience gets bored.
Yeah.
That audience that you want feedback from, that you want scored, they need to be engaged. And the vendor knows how to do that. But if you restructure everything they do to be all over the place instead of the correct order, it gets challenging and vendors are slightly different.
Yeah. Also, ask for that opportunity to get hands-on with the software, right? I mean, we've been in some recent demonstrations where in one room we are going through an on-screen demonstration, and in another room we have a number of workstations set up for employees to come in, log into the system, navigate to different screens, try out what they just saw in the presentation phase. This is really going to help people get a good understanding of what it would be like using that software on a day-to-day basis. And any vendor that is unwilling or incapable of providing hands-on access at this point in the procurement process, that's probably a red flag.
Probably a red flag. I would say that this is a better use of seeing a journal entry or an AP invoice process, because the system meets the requirements.
Right.
If what you care about is what's the feel and what's the process, do that hands-on. I think one thing that also sometimes gets underestimated is future direction. When you look at the requirements, they are based on all the legwork that gets done today and everything the business does today, right? But systems aren't static, and your needs aren't going to be either, right? The average life cycle of ERP is 15 to 20 years. It's so hard to know what 5 years into the future is going to look like, much less 20. But this is a big investment, both in terms of dollars and in terms of organizational effort. And it's something that you're going to want to ride for a long time. So you're hitching a wagon to it. What should you consider there?
Yeah, when you're selecting a vendor that you want to be with you for the long term, what you want to look at is the strength of that vendor now and how much they're committing to research and development, developing new functionality, maintaining a modern platform, and what, where they're investing in the future. And one example is, AI and machine learning. There's a lot of hype about this, and all of the ERP vendors right now are hyping up their commitment to AI and machine learning. Not many of them have a ton of practical use cases that use those.
But they're investing in them.
Technologies right now, but they're investing in. And you want to select a vendor that you're confident is going to be investing year over year in taking advantage of the latest innovations and not leaving your system to become stale and dated.
And it's going to change. It's just it's a good proxy to know that they're investing today. They have a development arm and they're keeping with the trends. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, this would have been cloud and multi-tenant, and there are certain investors that invested in that, and there's certain vendors that didn't and then got left behind, right? And that became legacy systems.
And speaking of cloud, with today's modern systems, oftentimes they're built upon one of the major cloud providers' platforms. And that's definitely a question you want to ask and evaluate that platform that the software lives upon. Look at the strength and the longevity of the platform and what innovations you believe are coming at the platform layer that the ERP vendor could then bring into the application.
Totally. One of the most underestimated aspects, I think, in terms of implementation is the successful outcome. Are some of the intangibles, right? And you look at it, when you're doing your system selection, you're going to find that all the vendors you look at have successes that they can point to. Other folks within your industry that were able to deploy the system successfully for the organization. They probably have instances where it was not deployed successfully. Yeah. And I'll tell you, the main variable is not the software itself, it's the people, right? People part is a big deal of this. These are big, long, complicated projects. It's a journey. You're going to go together. You're going to go on together with a partner. And I would suggest that along the way, you want to evaluate not just their level of talent, history, and references, but the organizational culture and fit with yours, right? Are you going to be able to work well with this implementation partner and their folks?
That's right. You're looking for a partner organization that's going to be with you through thick and thin, that's going to help manage conflicts and arrive at a solution that works best for you. And you're looking for an organization that really has your best interests in mind. There are a couple of factors here, and as you said, the most important one is the actual people, right? Who are the implementation consultants that you're going to be working with on a day-to-day basis? Now, in an RFP process, this can be challenging to identify. And in fact, some RFPs, many RFPs that we've seen, they try to address that challenge by asking for what is the actual implementation team that's going to do this project. Unfortunately, that's not really realistic for us to be able to commit resources to something that we don't know if we're going to get, and we really don't understand what the timeline might be for that project, as the majority of 90% of implementation timelines that are laid out in an RFP
don't actually match the timeline in the RFP. I mean, it's aspirational, and sometimes some organizations do. We're always surprised, but when we're putting down a specific team, it's based on a certain start date that we know you're probably not going to meet. So there's other ways to evaluate that.
Yeah, if we can't guarantee who the implementation team is at the point of RFP, how do we understand the talent pool that the partner brings to the table? Obviously, representative bios and maybe even interviews with some of the key resources are important, but that might only tell you who are the top 5 or 10% of your implementers team is not 100%. So take a look at, where's depth. Where is that organization based? Do they use offshoring? What is the average tenure of their employees? Or are they using a lot of contractors or external resources to do the project? What's the average industry experience of of the overall implementation team?
I would also add, right, we're obviously a third-party professional services firm, so it might sound a little self-serving, but from everything that we've seen, if I was ever in a position to implement an ERP, I would never choose the software vendor to do, right? It's the software vendor's professional services are in a position to represent the software vendor's best interest. They are not going to advocate for you.
Right.
And that has consequences.
One throat to choke is a fallacy. I think we've seen that, and I know our clients would agree, where ERP vendors are great at producing software, right? And are staffed up with product managers and developers and lawyers. They might not necessarily have on staff industry veterans or, maybe people that worked at organizations like their clients that really learned the nuances of the industry, learned the nuances of the business, learned how people operate, went through an ERP implementation at one point, really got that client experience firsthand, and then decided to make the jump and move into consulting. Organizations like maybe an independent partner are based upon those principles.
Yep.
And not only that, an independent partner oftentimes is going to be sized more appropriately to work with your organization. And what I mean by that is you want to look for a partner that your project is going to be a strategic project for that partner. That is going to have attention at the highest levels for that partner, and that your partner is 100% behind advocating for your best interests and helping navigate or diffuse any potential conflict between the client and the software vendor, bridging that gap and finding solutions that work for everyone.
Absolutely. So with that, we're gonna wrap it up here, and I think hopefully this has been a valuable use of your time and will be helpful along the way. But if we had to hit sort of the highlights, we would say that it pays off to do a little homework, do your research.
Get prepared.
Make sure you have an RFP that's clear and detailed enough and gives the vendor some flexibility. Keep the big picture in mind. Don't get lost in all the details. It's like, what's best for organization and what is likely to have a successful outcome. I can't stress the importance of the services partner, what the implementation is actually going to look like. And plan for a long-term partnership, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's how we view it. When we look at the other end, we have a vested interest in success. We want to know that we can be successful, and we're looking for a long-term strategic relationship. And of course, if you have any questions, you can email us at questions@rpic.com. We're always happy to chat and share anything we can do to help.
Yeah. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.